I remember it well. Flying on private jet planes over international cities and landing in places like Tenerife Island off the coast of Morocco, or maybe in Madrid or Barcelona. You see, we flew on private jets, and it was awesome that when we would land, I'd be able to look outside the window and see a blanket of people who were waiting there with their cameras and waving their flags. And when the hatch of the jet opens up, I step out on the top step, and when I look out, I'm looking for my ground man so he can give me a thumbs up that we're clear and that the ground's secured and that we can exit. And as I begin to walk down the steps, I notice the flash bulbs of cameras that are going off. No, they're not there taking pictures of me. I turn and I look back to the top, and very graciously I see Mark Anthony and his wife Jennifer Lopez standing at the top of the stairs, waving to the people as they walk down off of the G5. Wow, I can remember those days so clearly because I would always say to myself, life doesn't get any better than this. Or maybe I can recount the time of where I'm driving a $350,000 Rolls Royce. You see, this Rolls Royce isn't just any Rolls Royce because this one has 22-inch wheels with a name embossed in them. It says Sean John. You see, today isn't just any day in Miami, Florida. Today is the day that Diddy's going to be hosting the VMA Awards. And as he exits the Rolls Royce and 100 people come to attend to his every need and they take him inside, and I'm sitting there for the first time all by myself. I hear God. And he so clearly says to me, you're not doing what I created you to do. I told you, go and tell people what I've done for you. You see, my story didn't start in private jets and expensive cars. My story started as a little boy. All I wanted to do was know my real father, and to this day I've never met my real father. But back then it made me angry and it made me want to fight, and so my anger would always turn into violence, and my violence was somehow curbed when I was introduced to football. And I remember my first season running over 1,000 yards and scoring 12 touchdowns and playing in the state championship game. And I remember playing high school basketball and shooting the three-point shot, and even scoring 1,000 points wasn't enough. Somehow I felt that would make my daddy love me. But it didn't. My last year of high school, I ended up losing eligibility because I switched schools for athletic purposes. I lived in an apartment all by myself. And I remember when they told me that I was going to lose eligibility, how crushed I was because I didn't have any other plan but to play ball. The next thing I knew, I was 18 years old and about to have a baby. The only thing I can think to do is try to escape, try to run, and try to reject the child. She had our boy, and I was there. And let me tell you, it was the greatest day of my life. I didn't go to college. Instead, I made a series of bad choices, and I started going to New York City, and I started picking up cocaine, and I began to saran wrap it around my legs all the way up to my torso, and then I'd put on a double-breasted suit, and I'd slick back my hair just right, and I'd pick up a briefcase, and I'd walk with that cocaine straight through the metal detectors, daring someone to catch me. I'd drop off that cocaine, and somehow I justified morally that what I was doing wasn't wrong, because you see, I wasn't a drug user. I never used drugs, but I was a drug entrepreneur. And so as I began trying to build that network, I remember one occasion where there was a knock at the door, and as I opened up the door, 3 men stood there and they wanted their money back. And if they didn't get their money back, they were coming back to burn my house down. I grabbed my son and I handed him off to his mother, and I casually walked to the back of the house and I grabbed the Louisville Slugger, and I met those 3 men and I beat those men down to the ground with that bat. You see, what I didn't know was that I was going to get arrested. 3 times in 2 different states within 3 months. And the first time it was for gun possession, the second time it was for a grand jury indictment, and the third time it was for drug trafficking. I was looking at 38 years in prison, and I was guilty of all 38 years. The night I got arrested, I called my mother at 2 o'clock in the morning, and no mother wants to receive a phone call from her son at 2 a.m., especially not when he's locked up or in trouble. And I remember her telling me later that after that phone call, she looked up into heaven and she said, "God, if you exist, please help my boy." He heard her prayer that day. When I got arrested, on the 3rd time, a man came up and he punched me. And I took my food tray and I tried to smash this man into the wall of the prison. And when I did, the correctional officers ran in and they said, "Veneta, you want to go to church?" I said, "Man, I don't want to go to no effing church." And just as I turned to walk away, I ended up going to church that day. Church was a 4x4 prison cell with one other man. He didn't look like me. He was twice my age. He was African American. I remember sitting on the floor of the prison in my orange jumpsuit that buttoned from the belly up to the neck, and I was huffing and puffing because I did not want to listen to what he had to say. And then he looked at me and he said 8 words that would change my life forever. He said, "You look burdened. You look burdened. You look burdened. Can I pray for you?" And as that man prayed for me and I asked Jesus Christ to come into my heart and to come into my life, I didn't know what had happened, but something began to change. Andrew asked me about my son, and I proudly began to tell him about my boy Bradley and how he was going to be just better than me and he wasn't going to make the mistakes that I made. And as I finished talking to him, I remember there were tears coming down my face that felt as cold as ice cubes because my heart that was stone had begun to break and I had begun to allow God into my life. And then Andrew wrote me a 1.5-page letter, and I would stand in the crack of my prison cell every night with a little bit of light shining through, and I would read that prayer because I didn't know how to pray to God myself. I didn't know how to talk to my Father. And so as I began to talk to him 21 days later, my bail was reduced from $50,000 to $500,000. God was at work in my life and I was talking to him. And I remember as I went to prison on that 7 years mandatory, the first day I stepped on the yard, that 7 years was cut to 3.5 because the prisons were overcrowded. My daddy loves me. And he began showing me that if I would just trust him, he would change my life forever. I made it out of prison in 2.5 years. My son's now 21. He's in the United States Navy, stationed in San Diego, California. And his last message to me was, "Dad, I want to come and do what you're doing." You see, when I was 21, I was looking at 38 years in prison. But because I was a father to my son, he now never has to go through what I've been through. And so when I go and when I speak to young men and women in prisons and schools all over the country, I look at them in the eyes and I wrap my arm around them and I tell them that I love them. And they say, "How can you love me? You don't even know me." I say, "I love you because I am you."